Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight. Former Director General of Al Jazeera Network, Wadah Khanfar. The Assistant Minister for Social Services and Multicultural Affairs, Seselja. Claire Wardle, the Research Director at First Draft, which targets fake news. Veteran journalist, editor and broadcaster Mark Day, and Labor frontbencher Terri Butler. Please welcome our panel. Our Q&A is live on ABC TV in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. It's live everywhere else on News 24 at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Time. And you can watch and listen live on iView, YouTube, Facebook, ABC News Radio and Periscope. Well, our first question tonight comes from David Luswich.
Thanks very much, Tony. With the various forms of news delivery I have on a number of occasions posted what I believe to be legitimate news, only to be told by my young and learned son-in-law beside me here that my news broadcast was rubbish and incorrect. How can we tell and know the news we read and distribute is in actual fact true?
Claire Wardle, let's start with you.
So, times have changed. It used to be that we had gatekeepers. We had the ABC, everybody knew, they went to their newsagent and they paid their money and they got their newspaper. Now, increasingly, news comes to us. It comes to us via text message or email or over Facebook or Twitter. And the design of it is very complicated. We don't know what's what, which is the mainstream media, which is a blogger, which is a friend sharing a rumour. So it's really difficult now to make sense of all of this. And so as society, we're having to change and learn as the technology is developing. So as citizens of information and consumers of information, we have to learn how to be critical of the information we consume. And journalists have got a really important role to play in helping audiences navigate the information ecosystem. But as users, we also have to take responsibility for checking what we're receiving and, crucially, what we share ourselves. We now become publishers when we share, and so we have a responsibility to think about that before we click retweet.
OK, you talk about the difference between misinformation and disinformation. Quickly spell out for us what the difference is.
So misinformation is when, for example, my mum shares something that she finds on Facebook without checking. She doesn't mean any harm.
A bit like David.
For example. Disinformation is kind of systematic attempts to deceive. And increasingly we're seeing that whether it's from certain regimes or whether it's from hoaxers or whether people are trying to profit from, certain types of information. So there's a difference, I think, from people who just make mistakes versus people who are deliberately trying to deceive.
Now, before we move on to the other panellists, you actually, and I think it's fair to say you consider yourself to be on the front line of an information war. I mean, should we be worried about that?
Yes, we should.
Why? Tell us why.
So,
how worried?
Well, for me, I talk about almost a kind of an air pollution crisis when we think about information. That actually we now have systematic attempts to deceive with things like bot networks. We have automated Twitter bots which are pushing out information in terms of deception. We have troll factories that people turn up to spaces and are told what to put into the web to deceive. So we have to be very aware of the scale of this. And certainly in Europe, with the French election and German elections, there's huge concerns about attempts to cause deception. And so as consumers, again, we have to be really aware of that and, again, take responsibility for checking. But we should be scared. I mean, information war does seem like it's over the top, but unless we're aware of how sophisticated these disinformation campaigns can be, I think we're gonna be fooled in ways it's not just, oh, that was a mistaken photo. It's much more than that.
So, Mark Day, are you scared that we're in some sort of information war?
I think we're certainly in an information war. Scared? No. Apprehensive? Yes. We've got to remember we've been here before. When the printing press was invented, all sorts of people came out and they started writing stuff and printing pamphlets and disseminating it. And most of it was false. Most of it was made up.
Were you around when that happened, Mark? I was going to say, we've been here before historically, is what
Well, historically, yes, absolutely. But in time, rules were brought to the table and generally agreed, and there was always debate around the edges and always will be. And I think that's where we're at now. We need now to define the rules that Facebook and Google and Twitter must follow, or else.
I mean,
I'm very much in favour of free speech.
When you've talked about and written about fake news being a cancer that's eating away at the credibility of journalism.
Well, absolutely, because and when I began in this game, newspaper writers or editors were like standing on a hill with a megaphone. It was a one-way street. You barked into the megaphone and everybody heard what you had to say. Now, everybody answers back. And the person standing there on the top of the hill with the megaphone can't hear what any individual is saying. This cacophony is coming back and saying, you know, I say one thing, you say no. Where does the truth lie in that? Truth today is discretionary. It's an emotional decision. It's what you choose to believe. And that's a worry.
Let's see if Wadah is worried. I mean, you ran one of the biggest broadcasters for quite some time. What do you think about this?
Actually, I'm much more worried about the status of mainstream media, not the social media. Social media is doing something, in my opinion, as a result for our failure. To a large extent, mainstream media during the last at least 2 decades is declining. The trust in mainstream media is declining because I think we came very close to centers of powers. We are not putting the human being at the center. We are not anymore the voice for the voiceless. We have lost courage. We are trying to be much more corporate than free and independent. This is why people are searching for other outlets in order to understand what's happening in the world. If we have this kind of journalism, which has been in its golden era, for example, you know, if you remember the great journalists who have been challenging, speaking truth to power, I think people, I believe in the wisdom of the crowd, people would follow and understand that this is what authenticity is all about, and then social media, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, is not going really to alter the reality. But in fact, we are giving up and we are evacuating our fortresses and others are occupying it.
Were you surprised, though, I mean, listening to the information war that Claire was just describing to us earlier, we described surprised at the influence that Russia was able to have on the US election?
Yeah, I'm not surprised, actually, with this kind of international situation and the status of transformation and flux that we're going through, everything could happen. Now, the issue is the following. Are we going to resume some kind of professional? I agree with you, we need this kind of professionalism that could be injected again in the minds of people. We need to engage with the public in educating and in also telling them exactly what they should be, how they should read us, how they should define our biases, how they should look up what mistakes do we do. I think we as journalists, we have much higher ethical role to play in educating the public on how to figure out our own biases before even we start with them, telling them that your Facebook is full of nonsense. No, I think we sometimes are actually giving them a bad role model on how to do news and how to spread it and how to analyze it and to contextualize it.
I just want to quickly go back to Claire, and I'll bring in the politicians in the next question, because I think this is actually a good one to let the journalists and the analysts sort of deal with. But you were talking about the information war, and we know that Russia had this sort of tremendous influence. How sophisticated is the sort of operation that a state actor like Russia can bring to bear onto news?
So if we think about propaganda in previous eras, it was about broadcasts, and if you watched a broadcast, you could talk about propaganda. The problem now is that you're receiving this information from your trusted networks. So when you receive information via Facebook and it's actually from your friend, you're much more likely to believe it. So what we've seen is these masters of propaganda, and Russia is an example of this, taking their sophisticated models of persuasion and putting them on top of our very sophisticated models of social dissemination strategies. So the social networks never really thought about the dark arts. They were saying, oh, this is going to save the world, the internet's going to connect everybody. And they hadn't thought about what does it mean when you can micro-target. On Facebook, you can deliver advertising saying, I specifically want this to go to a certain particular community or a certain person who lives in this zip code. And we haven't thought about what that means when people can use micro-targeting in ways that advertising before on the side of a bus wasn't that smart. We're now much smarter, we have that technology, and I think that's what we need to be aware of.
Okay, let's go to a specific example. We've got a question from Elizabeth Chambers.
Thanks, Tony. Donald Trump has refused to apologise for the White House airing unverified claims that the former President Obama asked Britain's spy agency to monitor the Trump election campaign. Mr. Trump continues to stick by his assertion despite denials by a host of officials. At what point do we stop questioning the validity of what is being reported to us when the highest people in office will only ever acknowledge information that others claim to be fake?
Okay, our question was Elizabeth Chalmers, not Chambers. And Seselja, I'll start with you. What do you think about this kind of thing happening in the White House?
Well, look, obviously it's a tricky thing, I guess, in some ways, as a minister in a government to be commenting on because it is US domestic politics. But if I look at the general point, Elizabeth, there is no doubt that if a politician makes a claim and they can't back it up, over time they will lose credibility. And if you can't back up what you say, our credibility is very important to us. And we could argue that politicians right across the board have from time to time not lived up to that, and they certainly often get punished for that. But we need to value our credibility. And one of the things I think with the Trump phenomenon, when you look at it, is Donald Trump has certainly said very forcefully that he doesn't trust the media, and certainly many of his supporters don't trust the media. But I think the point...
Do you have any sympathy for him in that regard, Zed?
Well, as politicians, we have an interesting relationship with the media, of course. It's love-hate might be one way to describe it. We know how important it is to get the message out. It's important that we're scrutinised. Anyone who believes in democracy believes in a free and open press. We don't always like a lot of what they come up with, and sometimes, it's fair to say we think that they're biased or they're not being fair or maybe they're not giving us an adequate go. But
So what do you think about a president who decides to avoid the media completely to get his message across? He uses Twitter in late-night Twitter frenzies, and he's able to speak directly to a certain group of American voters.
He is, and it's a very powerful medium at the moment, and that's been one of the things that social media has done. It's given politicians and others, celebrities, a direct line to people who want to follow them. So that's a very powerful position for them to be, and of course it was a part of his success was he was able to go directly. Now, but I think the point that Wadah was making in terms of where some of the mainstream media may have lost some credibility over time, and I've seen various surveys right around the world showing that confidence in media has dropped in recent years. In fact, I saw a survey recently that showed actually in Australia it had dropped and it's lower than in the United States. Obviously there'll be different indexes. But if the mainstream media doesn't have the trust, it of course will be much easier for a politician, particularly, effective politician who has a very big following, to avoid them. But there's always going to be that tension, and Donald Trump and every other politician will be kept to account by the media. But whether he or others can go around them indefinitely, I guess remains to be seen.
Terri Butler, we'll bring you in.
Well, look, I think that there's a real problem of trust as well. I think trust is probably going to be the watchword of tonight. But it's a lack of trust in institutions.
Terri, we've got a problem with your microphone. We're going to come back to you in a second once we deal with that. I'll go across to Khanfar to hear what he's going to say.
Luckily, I'm not a politician and I'm not a member of a government, so I can speak freely. I'm a journalist. I think Trump is a big joke. I think Trump is going to fail. Trump has been running a show. Literally, he came from a show, director or show participant, and he thinks that he can continue running a show. I think he couldn't realize that, okay, during elections, you may have a show. Sometimes all of us have shows during elections. But when it comes to real office, now you are a statesman. Trump doesn't understand what does that mean. So he continued to run the show. Now, will that deliver to the state, to the public, to his particular, audience, to the people who he promised to enhance the reality? Is he going to be able to deliver with this kind of shows and the tweets and making joke about media and so on and so forth? I don't think so. This could continue for a while. This could be entertaining for all of us, but he is not a statesman. And therefore, I think he is going to fail. And even his followers are going to realize that they have been, another misled. Yes, there is hatred to the mainstream in Washington. Yes, he capitalized on that. But what alternative is going to offer? I don't see that he is the best person to really drain the swamp, as he's saying.
But a lot of his supporters love the fact that he's outside the mainstream. So I think, to go back to your point, lots of people, his supporters, they want to believe that. So they don't care that lots of people are saying that that's false. They desperately want to believe it, and so they're not going to look for any other information. So that's...
But Claire, he promised them jobs. He promised them that the factories will come back. If he doesn't deliver on his promise,
I agree with
after
that.
a while, Okay, what good in him?
Okay, but Claire and Terry's microphone's fixed in a minute, so, but you're halfway through a point, so I'll just bring you to one of the things that one of his advisors said, and that is that there are a series of things called alternative facts. You can have two sets of facts.
Yes.
You can have one and then you can have the other. I mean, that seems to be the sort of world we're operating in the White House, because everyone has denied, everyone that counts so far has completely denied that the Obama regime bugged him during the election campaign, but he just simply refuses to believe it.
Yeah, but that's the problem, is because of Twitter, he can go directly to his audiences and say whatever he likes. And the more he says it's fake news, which is why none of us should use that phrase, the more he says that,
What phrase
I
do
talk
you
about
use?
the misinformation ecosystem.
Not as catchy. No, it's not.
You'll get a big catchy headline from that.
But what he's essentially saying is, don't trust anybody else, trust me. Just follow my Twitter account and trust me. And that's why it's so dangerous, because in a democracy, we have to have a free press. So we can joke about his use of the term fake news, but he's doing it deliberately, and he's being very successful.
Terry, I'll bring Terry in because we did cut you off because your microphone wasn't working.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So what I wanted to say before is that we've got a trust problem that's more broad than any individual politician or any individual journalist or commentator, and that's a problem with trust in institutions. People don't trust the mainstream media, and they don't trust democracy, and they don't trust unions, and they don't trust churches. They trust very few people, and they trust the people that they know. And the problem, of course, with that is that it's those institutions that we need to be able to persist, so that it doesn't matter whether an individual politician or journalist or commentator or priest is terrible or amazing. The institutions themselves have to continue to be there for society. And so the real question is not, is Donald Trump a good or bad president? The real question is, how do you make sure that a democracy can continue to be sustainable, regardless of if you have a terrible president or a great president? And I think that those are really the much bigger questions for us on democracy, but also on media. And I was saying this to someone before, when people don't trust media, they don't trust newspapers, they don't trust television stations, and that sort of idea is thrown around really casually as though you just can't trust anyone. That's a problem for democracy as well, because of course the antidote to Donald Trump saying things of the nature that you described, or the antidote to any politician saying things that don't withstand scrutiny, is a really free and strong media. And to have that, there's a real crisis for the media at the moment, and that is that business models are collapsing.
Except, oddly enough, because of the Trump victory, the New York Times, the Washington Post subscriptions have gone through the roof.
And this is the point.
They're probably healthier than they've ever been.
So there was people probably have heard of Clay Shirky, who's an academic in relation to journalism, and he said maybe 10 years ago, is there even a mass market for quality journalism? Because people used to buy a newspaper and you didn't know whether they were buying it for the TV guide or the Dilbert comic or the sports section or the news or the business. But now we're finding that people are able to buy a specific piece of content, and so you're seeing what there is a mass market for. And I think what's happening now, when there is this crisis of trust, people are looking for an authoritative voice that they can trust. And so those mastheads that can persuade people that their brand is solid and that they are authoritative and trustworthy will do well. I think that poses a problem for the tabloids, who are trading on hyperpartisanship, which just breeds scepticism and cynicism in everyone who doesn't share that particular partisanship. So long term, I think trust is what's going to sell. Right now in Australia, I don't think it's that. I think it's confirmation bias, buying the paper that's going to tell you what you already want to hear.
So, Mark, what do you think about that? And in relation to Trump, and bear in mind that Sean Spicer, who was a journalist who had a degree of respect, is out there using the bully pulpit to spread some of these ideas.
It's quite bizarre, but I think it's right that the only thing we can do is continue to report the truth, to do it fearlessly, to do it loudly, to do it honestly, and hope in time that people come to understand that you can't have a decent society based on alternative facts. Only the facts will do. The whole democracy is built on us making decisions which are based on facts, not on cockamamie ideas, not on something that seemed like a good idea at the time. If you don't have the facts, you don't have the foundation for a family, a society, a democracy. So it's desperately important that we understand this. But people choose to believe what they want, and there's no answer to that. You can't stop somebody saying you can't believe this, because people will believe what they want. There's no way you can enforce truth. But you can keep going at it.
You can check the facts.
Indeed, but even after the facts are checked, people don't want to believe it. You know, even in my own family, I've got people who believe we didn't go to the moon. That was all filmed in Arizona. And I say, but hang on, you know, I'm so old. I was in Houston when they landed on the moon in 1969.
You weren't on the moon.
I wasn't on the moon. And there my argument failed. Because unless I could say I was on the moon and give them a bit of moon dust, which I'd say I probably picked up on the beach or something. But no, they choose not to believe it. And it's just so puzzling to me. All my life I've been searching for facts. And even members of my own family say it didn't happen, it's not so, because they've looked it up on the internet and it seemed credible, and you know, alternative facts, they believe it. Get out of here.
Let's move. Let's move on. We've got a related question from Melanie's son.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So the US presidential election seemingly brought to the fore an erosion in journalistic values. The victim mentality of name-calling and labelling has dominated a lot of the media. Trump's immigration policies are labelled as racist due to the seemingly anti-Latino policies, such as building a wall along the US-Mexico border. But Trump did win the Latino vote, for example, in the Nevada caucus. Is our sense of well-meaned intentions, but often oversimplified discussion on very complex issues, another form of populism? And why does it seem that the discussion around populism is largely one-sided around Trump being anti-elitist?
Wadah, I'll start with you.
Yeah. You know, I think what is happening right now is a great transition internationally. Just all over, especially in Europe, the Western world at this moment in time is going through transition. There is economic crisis, the world order is not stable anymore, new rules are going to be redefined in media, in politics, in economics. So we might be the last of our kind as a generation who has been a continuity of the past. The future is going to be something different. Now we are in a state of transition. Even cognitively, we are not stable yet. I think we are now trying to adapt. This is why we have some confusing behavior, you know, as you said rightly, you know, Trump is classified as someone who is anti-Latinos, but eventually a lot of Latinos could elect him, or anti-Muslims, and some Muslims could elect. So this is a situation, in my opinion, in transition. This is why it puts on our shoulders a heavy burden. Journalism from now on is not going to be entrusted only on facts. It's going to be entrusted on contextualization, on understanding reality and putting that in context. A journalist should become now a researcher, should become a historian, should become someone. Our newsrooms should become think tanks rather than just collecting and redistributing news in a short format. I think we are losing it if we do not reclaim another role that could stabilize the current mess that we are going through.
So to go to one of the points of the questioner there, do you think that the discussion in the mainstream media about Trump is one-sided, that it's sort of missing the point as to why what he's saying is appealing to large numbers of people?
Yes, it might be, in a way or another, we could not understand his followers, what they are going to do. The margin in the United States of America, they were with him because of certain reasons. And I think since we have been biased towards the center, we have become, on our case, we have become also much more aloof, much more far from the public. So therefore, we couldn't understand, we couldn't predict, we couldn't forecast that a lot of people could support Trump. We are part of the power now, not part of the public. And that is the misconception that we have about reality. But the second issue, we are right when we defend freedom and democracy and tolerance, and we fight against anyone, president or whoever, is going to timber with this kind of rules. These are the rules of democracy. These are the cardinal pillars of what we perceive as a good life, and we cannot give up on them.
Zed, what do you think?
Well, Melanie, I think it's a very good point, and a couple of points I'd make in response. One is certainly I think there's been a number of journalists from mainstream news outlets in the US after the election who acknowledged, I think, that They probably needed to take a bit of a look at themselves in terms of how they covered Trump. There is no doubt that I think there would have been a very strong bias, certainly from a lot of the coverage I saw. Now, of course, journalists would argue, well, you know, we were doing a service because we didn't think he was good for democracy or whatever it might be. But journalists do have a responsibility to cover things as fairly as they possibly can without putting too much of their own slant on it. But I think that President Trump, and so much discussion about it, and let's face it, he makes very good copy for many of our news outlets. Discussion and focus on a personality sometimes misses what it actually was and why it was that the people in the United States chose to elect him. And there's a number of reasons. And if you look at some of the forces, the economic forces, the dislocation that many had suffered, feelings of social dislocation and social change, and those ideas around sovereignty with things like border security, which of course President Trump tapped into. Those are real fears, those are real concerns, and clearly they were real concerns for many people in the United States. And I suppose the more that those concerns were dismissed and the more that they were called racist, if you know you're concerned about immigration, that may have strengthened the decision-making of people who were choosing to buck much of the media and much of the elite was telling them to do. And so I think we shouldn't get completely obsessed with personalities. I think we should look at some of those underlying causes, which, you know, certainly Brexit, there were some similarities, and we could look around the world.
So when you look at his executive orders to ban Muslims from certain countries for a temporary period coming to the United States and refugees, do you sort of have sympathy with that? I mean, do you sort of see that as similar to what John Howard did when he said, we'll decide who comes to this country and the manner in which they come? Is that what you're sort of alluding to there?
Well, I think the way he described it, that he banned Muslims, my understanding is he had bans on mainly Muslim countries. There's no doubt a number of countries, and obviously that's been scaled back and still playing out in the courts to some degree. But in terms of the issue of sovereignty and making sure that we, you know, that certainly the context you use in terms of John Howard, it's not about Islam, but it is about absolutely making sure that we are clear on and control our borders. That is, I think, at the basis of a sovereign nation, that you do control who comes in. Now, we should only use that for the security of our people and for the good order of our nation, and I think that's what we do. But you know, sovereignty and control of your borders is a big factor for people, and to the extent I think where people feel that they've lost control of their borders, as has been the case, I think the feeling in Europe in recent times, and to an extent obviously was a factor in the United States, people will push back against that in various ways.
Do you accept that's what Trump is actually doing?
I don't know actually what happened to our liberal values. All our societies are societies of immigrants, refugees who come from across the world. They developed great civilizations and they made fantastic, you know, societies. Yeah. Suddenly now we wake up and we feel this exaggerated fear from refugees, from Muslims, from Latinos, from Afro-Americans, and suddenly all of us are bringing the worst in us. In fact, I don't feel that the world is healthy at this moment in time. This is not going to help neither peace, nor security, nor prosperity in any society. Imagine if we start attacking these sub-identities. Imagine to what extent that could lead. You know, it's not going to really give us any reassurance that we are stable. This is why we think we have a moral value, we have ethical responsibility towards those who are oppressed, those who cannot really have a place to live in. And we, as societies, developed societies, prosperous societies, part of the thing that we should do is to share with others as well. So this kind of fear, in my opinion, is exaggerated for political reasons. And there is a rise of nationalism across Europe in particular and the Western societies, which capitalize on that and exaggerate it and put it out of context.
Claire, and I'll bring you in to think about how Donald Trump actually did this, how he really confused the mainstream media and managed to get into power. And I've heard you quote Trump supporters who, after the victory, said, we memed him into the presidency, we directed the culture. What do you make of that?
Yeah, this is terrifying. If you've listened to this piece of audio, it's during the deplorable which was during the inauguration night. And all these people who had essentially been using memes. So there's a number of young people in the audience, so you understand this. Older people in the audience might not understand this. But memes, people dismiss. But these kind of images that go viral on Facebook, which are images with text on top, get dismissed as, not important. They are really pushing out disinformation. They don't really get verified very much. And there's actually another great piece which was about some teenagers in the US that have meme shells that they're dropping into the French election context. They can't speak French, but they just take these images, then they just take them, and then they drop them into Twitter in France. And everybody dismisses it because it's memes. But this idea of directing the culture, we need to recognise this. This isn't just transmission of A piece of information to B. There's a ritual around why we share information. We gossip for a reason. We have to understand the human condition. We have to understand social psychology and memes and understanding memes and their power, particularly around race. If you start looking at racist memes, it's appalling, but if we dismiss that and don't understand how that's being used on social networks, we're in trouble.
Are memes closer to satire, though, than sort of journalistic information?
So I know I've got a bad reputation now for coming up with new terms, but memes as a term are actually unhelpful because we can have memes that are jokey and funny. We can also have memes that are dangerous. So actually we need to come up with different terminologies there, but they've become weaponized. This idea that you can drop this seemingly, this visual into the culture when actually it is being directed, when it's being used systematically and pushed out. And you've seen this through automated bots, the same meme being pushed out. So we can't dismiss it.
The thing you were talking about with the kids in the United States influencing the French or attempting to influence the French election, we're talking about 16-year-olds in the Midwest.
Yeah, and they would come down to dinner and they'd be like, and the parents would say, "What did you do?" "Oh, I was just online playing with memes." No idea that these teenagers, these 16-year-olds, had very sophisticated understandings of the information ecosystem and were from their bedrooms in Indiana directing the culture in France.
But should we take it seriously? I mean,
yes.
Why?
Because if we don't measure what's happening and actually map out those rumours and hoaxes that are being pushed out in what seems benign but aren't, and in certain cultures, that got shares much more. So a piece of research about Breitbart, when you actually look at what Breitbart posts on its Facebook page, it's overwhelmingly links, but when you look at what's actually shared in huge numbers, it's visuals and videos. So our brains are much less critical of visuals. So images are actually what I'm much more concerned about. We're much more likely to share that without thinking and stopping. A fake news article with a headline and 900 words, we might stop and think. A meme seems like, well, that's funny. That will, make my friends laugh, without realising what that's actually doing.
I'll just quickly go to Terri. Threat or an opportunity here for political parties?
Well, it's interesting. We were talking before about how you can really target advertising now, and in the same way you can really target news. And so you see this all the time where there was a site in the US called Red Feed, Blue Feed, which I'm sure you've heard of, which shows you how a Facebook feed looks for someone who's a Democrat voter and how a Facebook feed looks for someone who's a Republican voter, and really shows you just how targeted what you're getting in your feed is based on your own prejudices and preconceptions. And that's because you know people who share the same views as you like things that you agree with, and so you're constantly being bombarded with things that reinforce your existing preconceptions.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop you there. I'll bring you back in a sec. We've got a question on this subject, so I'll go straight to that. That's from Jan Monahan. Hi, Jan.
Good evening. My question is, it is human nature to rarely change your opinion once it has been made. And with Facebook's algorithm to generate stories on your newsfeed that support what you have previously liked or shared, it is hard to resurface from the quicksand that is our social media intake. Is the fault our own, or are we simply being led into the wrong direction with fake news being such an epidemic?
Okay, I'll go back to Terri because I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh, no, but yeah, I mean, it's so true. When I want to advertise to people, and by advertise I mean talk about a political issue, then I will put money behind my Facebook post and I'll target it to your age, your interests, your geographic location. So if I can do that, obviously for the forces of good.
Yes, do you have young staffers who create memes in the way that we've just been describing and use them as political weaponised sort of information?
I think, Tony, the last time one of my staff created a meme was when I came on your show and they incorrectly supered me as a Liberal MP. And we turned it into a meme and asked people for fundraising money. So
that's just mean.
Thanks for that, Tony.
Mark, what do you think?
Well, I think memes can be very entertaining. And they can also, as Claire said, be very damaging or do great harm. But people, when they see them, I don't think they necessarily believe them. But the problem is, the flip side is when they see real news, they don't necessarily believe that either. And so how you differentiate news you can trust with news that may not be news, that's the big issue that I think the mainstream news media has to come to terms with.
And what about this, the question from Jan there, that effectively Facebook is operating as a kind of echo chamber. It picks up through the algorithms what you're interested in and gives you news
gives you more of it.
Feeds what you know.
So it goes around and around and around, and your horizons become lower and lower, and you're in an echo chamber. That's the great. I'm old. I read newspapers. That's the great thing about newspapers. You turn the page, you never know what you'll find. There'll be something of interest, something that's factual that you never knew you needed to know. But when you're in an echo chamber, all you're getting is more of what you're getting, and the more you get, the more you get. It's a big problem, and I don't have the answer to it. And if I did, I'd be a multi-millionaire.
Well, Claire's been studying it, so I'll go to her.
No, I mean, it was such a smart question. And ultimately, when we're thinking about solutions to misinformation, the platforms really have to play a key part in that. And the difficulty is, as a commercial entity, it's not really in Facebook's interest to solve this, because when we're in our echo chamber and we're receiving information that makes us feel good because it confirms our biases, we spend longer on Facebook, which means we see more ads. So my concern in all of this is that it will only be solved with the help of the platforms. And so that means that we have to keep putting pressure onto the platforms to say, actually, Facebook in particular, and there's other social networks, but that's the behemoth, plays a huge role in terms of how people now receive information. They can't be let off the hook, and we need to put pressure on them.
Facebook is now talking about using those same algorithms to flag up potential hoax material. I mean, is that the sort of thing that you're talking about, and could that solve the problem?
So, for example, in the US, they have rolled out something which means that if you see something that you think might be fake news, you can flag it on Facebook and it will go into a queue of information, and fact-checking organisations will then fact-check that information and put it back into the system, which means if you then go to share that, you'll get a warning that says, do you know that this has been disputed by fact-checkers? The problem is, lots of people see that flag and go, well, that probably means it's true then, because I don't believe the liberal media. So we actually have to do a lot more work to understand how this is actually operating. There are questions around algorithmically, could they depress that? In the rankings, does it that you're less likely to see that? But then that gets into dangerous territories about what do we see and what we don't see. So it's a really complex problem. So keep asking the question, because it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Zed wants to jump in.
Well, I think that goes to the point about, if you look at, if you give Facebook that power, first, how much do you trust Facebook? And secondly, how much power are you granting Facebook? Outside of that space, yes, there's a lot of fake stuff, false stuff, half-truths that are out there. But I guess it's a slightly more democratic one, and you can look for things. If you're giving an all-powerful group like Facebook that ability to say, this is fake, this isn't, there's a real concern about that as well for many people to say, well, how much are they screening what I'm seeing based on their political views, or how much are they screening it based on what they think is good for me? And people would push back against that. So I think Facebook, for their brand, would obviously want to be very careful, because, I mean, one of the things I think in this discussion is that, I'm a little bit like Mark. I'm a bit younger. I'm about to hit half-time, I think, but I'm what Paul Keating might call a young fogey. I like to read newspapers, and I still go to the brands that I trust, but I'll go to most of the mainstream ones. And so, yes, there is a level of filtering that I get. I'm concerned about my kids' generation because they don't have that attachment to that. So they're going to be getting it in a whole different way. So there's an education thing there. And there's also a responsibility on each of us to say, well, we should be checking what's coming in and not necessarily believing. And the internet is a wonderful thing where if you really want to find out, it's really not that hard to figure out whether something's fake. You can tend to test it yourself.
Terri.
Zed, it's not just accuracy that's the problem. So you can be getting 100% accurate stuff, but it's all of this stuff that just confirms your own prejudices. So if you're only getting news that you're interested in, that you already agree with, then that is in and of itself a problem, even though it's completely accurate. And you see
another
things...
generation would just pick which newspaper they're going to read. Like, sure. I might read The Australian, or I might read Fairfax, have different political perspectives.
Or even both. The ABC. Yeah. So you get a balance. You work it out yourself. It may be that certain newspapers have a right-wing stance and others have a left-wing stance. And you're a reader, you read them, you look at that and you say, OK, I get it.
But if you're getting your
It's
news
not too hard.
from your Facebook news feed, you're not buying both newspapers.
No,
and
that's
you're
right.
you're
A lot
only
more
seeing
difficult, yes, I'm
you're only
agreed.
seeing the version that is going to suit your own prejudices. So, and a story can be completely accurate and also completely slanted. So, for example, the recent AB Original story, you know, they won this great award at the band. And one paper had them a nice colour photo and a great thing about how positive it was that an Indigenous group had won this thing. And then you had another paper with a really black and white grim photo, same photo, just photoshopped to black and white, and a really negative headline about how a group that wanted to change the date of Australia Day was being fated by the whoever. And so you can slant your... Those are both accurate, those are both facts. They are Indigenous and they have wanted to change Australia Day's day.
So where's the problem in that? You've got both sides of the story.
Sure,
Is
if
there a
you're
problem?
getting both sides of the story, but if in your Facebook feed you're just getting the one that already suits your own prejudices, then we are having the echo chamber effect, because all you're seeing is news written in a way to suit your prejudices, and dealing with the accuracy of that does not go to the heart of the problem of the echo chamber.
Okay, we've got to move on. Remember, if you hear any fake news or dodgy facts on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanta. Keep an eye on our Twitter account and the Conversation website for fact checks by the experts. Our next question is a video. It's from Douglas Simpkin in Wollongong, New South Wales.
I would like to ask the panel what they think of the argument that frames the fake news phenomenon as an attempt by established legacy media channels to try and regain a sense of legitimacy, particularly after the election of Donald Trump shows that they no longer have control over the public narrative. Would you agree that by delegitimizing opinions and counter-narratives as fake news, mainstream media sources are, in actuality, attempting to suppress all dissident voices?
Claire Wardle, are you attempting to suppress dissident voices?
No, I'm not attempting to suppress dissident voices, but so in the US, in the last 3 months, there's been a lot of self-flagellation. I've been to about 6 fake news conferences in the last 7 weeks, and there's a lot of people who just feel really bad about what happened. And ultimately, you have to smile a little bit when these journalists say, why don't the audience listen to us? When actually the journalists haven't been listening to their audiences. So I think, you know, this piece now about the term fake news is so unhelpful on both sides. So you have Trump using it, you have mainstream media saying it about one another, and it's just becoming slurs. So I think, A, it should stop, and I think my fear is that we're kind of sitting in our different camps, and we're not having healthy discourse, and my concern is it's just going to get worse. And I think if we really care about democracy, we need to start thinking about the words that we're using and to listen to one another truly, and to say there's a reason why facts matter, there's a reason why healthy free press matters. So it's a really important question, but I do worry about how we're going down a settled tunnel.
Yeah, I think, Claire, what you are saying is very important. I think we need more Claires, internationally, in order to verify also and to question. That's important. But I agree as well with Terry that the issue is not only to verify. To contextualize is important. We, as media organizations or journalists, whatever, we, I think, should have a contextualized approach to news. Sometimes data are accurate lies. You have data, but you put it in a way that means exactly the opposite of what it could mean. So to contextualize is very important. To verify, of course, is very important. But also to have balance and distance. If we become a party in this whole chaos, and it is a Trump versus media versus a Trump, I think we should not. The neutrality concept now is much more important than ever. And I think this is how we could reclaim some kind of credibility, whereby all those who are confused in their echo chambers could really just start looking up again to journalists to guide them through this kind of confusion. So eventually, what's happening right now is not new. I think my grandmother, when she was living in a village in Palestine, one day when she sits with her neighbors, they had also their echo chamber, and they would have developed their own opinion about life and death, and they don't care exactly what the world looked like. But when they listen to BBC at 4 p.m., they know it is gospel. You know, it is important, it is fantastic, it is lovely. They follow the news. Now, that model does not exist anymore. We need to reclaim it. Let the people live in their echo chambers, but when they extend their ears outside the echo chamber, they can actually listen to something a little bit more credible.
I'll hear from Mark on that as well.
Yeah, providing context, I don't disagree with you, but that very often calls on people to give their opinions. And when you get into opinion, which newspapers tend to do more... Increasingly, not only newspapers, television networks as well. Increasingly, opinion is what carries the whole thing. When that happens, people are invited to choose to believe you or not to believe, because it's an opinion. You can have your opinion and I'll have my opinion. But the facts, they should be sacred, but the facts go into the same basket as opinions, and therefore you choose your facts as well. And that's where the whole thing breaks down. You need opinions to provide context, but you don't often get past first base.
Let's move on. We've got another question. It's from Edwin Nelson. Edwin, go ahead.
Yep. When Donald Trump calls CNN and the New York Times fake news, I believe that what he's saying is that there is a left-wing bias that exists across the mainstream media. And it applies to the ABCs as well. I feel that you tend to focus on left-wing issues. You focus on things like climate change or homosexual marriage or feminism. And there's very little engagement with things like Judeo-Christian values, family values, the role of the nation-state, or some of the problems with multiculturalism. So it's almost as if you, I feel, perpetuate by your choice of topic a bias in the same way that I think Terri was talking about. So do you agree with that? And what's the solution if you do?
Zed, I'll start with you. Is the media too progressive, to boil it down?
Well, it's interesting. I think I heard the outgoing chairman of the ABC talking about this the other day. And he was asked about whether the ABC has a left-wing bias, and I think his words, and people can fact-check this, it was words to this effect. I think he said, that they're probably to the centre-left, which is not that uncommon in the journalistic profession generally. Now, whether that's true or otherwise, certainly I think there's a perception that that's the case more broadly. There's obviously a diversity of opinions within the media. But to your point, Edwin, obviously we shouldn't pretend that there's no bias that comes into play, even from very professional journalists who are doing their best, because we all have a worldview that shapes the way we look at the world. And even when we are doing our level best to be right down the centre and as fair and impartial as we can, we're always going to be a little bit influenced by our view of the world, the way we see the world. So to the extent there is a centre-left bias, and I agree with you, I think in broad terms there is.
Pauline Hanson certainly thinks there is. She called today for the ABC's funding to be cut, for SBS to be gotten rid of altogether. Are those ideas going to be popular?
Well, we already cut your funding, but in terms of whether
you're not forecasting what's happening in the budget.
You'll have to ask the treasurer. You'll have to ask the treasurer, Tony. I've heard no such information. I doubt it, but we will see. But the point is would it be popular? Look, it certainly wouldn't be popular amongst ABC viewers, and ABC has a lot of loyal viewers. There's always a concern. I asked this question of Mark Scott, the former managing director of ABC at an Estimates once, and I said, is it the case that most of your presenters lean towards the left, and is that a problem? And the way he described it was he didn't say no, they don't lean towards the left. He said it doesn't matter because they're professional journalists. And I think in theory that's right, because I think we trust that you always try and do your best, but your worldview will always shape what you cover, what you don't cover, and a little bit of how you look at the world.
Terri Butler.
Well, one thing I like about opinion is that it makes a journalist be explicit about their own biases. So you learn about a journalist's worldview pretty quickly when they are prone to engaging in broadcasting or writing opinion. And that's certainly the case when I watch Sky, for example. There's always a lot of opinion mixed in with the broadcast, and it's great. It's fantastic because you're really clear about what people's views are. So I actually think that there is a role for that in terms of better understanding the political...
Not on the ABC, presumably, Terri.
Well, I've got to tell you, Tony, I don't have a lot of time to watch television, but when I watch the ABC, it's either your show, which always has a diversity of views, or it's the news. And I am a member of a left-wing organisation, so maybe I just can't detect biases that favour my own worldview, and maybe I've got a bunch of confirmation bias, it seems pretty likely. But I don't really detect any bias in the way that the news is reported. And I think you'd struggle to argue that the ABC News or that ABC 24 is biased in one direction or the other. If the argument's about programming content more broadly than the news and current affairs, then I think you'll probably find that notwithstanding they have cut the funding to the ABC, the government has been pretty active in looking to find ways to look at what the content is that's broadcast on the ABC TV channels and also on radio. And there's certainly been a move, for example, towards more regional and agricultural-based content, and that's been pretty obvious over the past few years. So I'm not sure that the criticism is particularly warranted.
I just want to hear from Claire on this, because the question began by saying Donald Trump calls CNN and the New York Times fake news. What he's really saying is that they've got a left-wing agenda.
Yeah, firstly, go and live in America for 2 years and then tell me that you don't need an ABC. If you live in a country that doesn't have a public service broadcaster, you realise what value it has.
I don't think I said
We would have
that.
had 27 advertising breaks.
I don't think I said that.
No, but I just feel like that you have to
Okay.
recognise what you have. And now I've lived in the US for 2 years, and
You
it's
need to tell
dreadful.
Pauline Hanson, Claire.
It's dreadful when
Get
you
on
don't
the
have a
phone to
public
her.
service broadcaster. Anyway,
Claire, I think he
question.
said that he loves us and hates us at the same time.
Okay,
I think that's a reasonable
Don't take
summation.
away Anyway, your question is a really important one. And the reason that people think that those particular outlets are left-wing is partly because, let's be truthful, many journalists are from that particular worldview. They desperately try to be professional, but they do not listen to the audience. So particularly in the US, most of the newsrooms are centred on either of the coasts, and they don't listen to their audiences. So if they did, and when there are attempts, there's a tool called Harkin, which actually asks the audience to give ideas for story selection. So actually, a big reason for bias isn't how a story is told, is that the story is featured in the first place. So actually, if we did a better job of listening to people and saying, hang on, you don't talk anything that, my values are not being represented right now on this issue, then I think we would have a very different media debate. But instead, we're not doing that. We're not listening to audiences properly. And that's why there's this idea about bias. So it's a really important question.
Sorry, Tony, and to that extent, that's I guess to some degree the positive side of what we've been talking about is how disparate it is and how people are in their own echo chamber. But there is a certain level of democracy there where if people genuinely feel that this news outlet or that is not reflecting their values or is being disdainful of them, they will look elsewhere. And it's up to the market to match that and have quality journalism in that direction. But there is a need then to respond and not, I guess, to be disdainful of some of the concerns that are raised from people who stop watching the mainstream news.
OK, we're running out of time. We've got a few questions that we need to get to. The next one is from Nasser Zahar. Nasser.
Hi. The 2005 Cronulla riots, to me, would have to be one of the most shameful days in Australian modern history. Fake news was sent via text to draw support on both sides, inflaming the riots further. Now we have Facebook, Twitter, etc., which is probably the most open online platform used by millions. More and more have the freedom to put out fake news, knowing it could spread like fire in a short period. Don't you think that it's inevitable that something worse than the Cronulla riots will be instigated on Facebook or Twitter, especially with the hate speech is on the rise, especially against Australian Muslims?
Yeah, Mark Day, what do you think?
Yes, I fear that. It's perfectly possible for it to happen. There are new technologies which allow lip syncing to be changed. You can have a video of Tony and I can look at a camera and what I say goes onto his lips. So I can...
They'll recognise your voice, though.
Well, no, it's still...
I'm only kidding.
Oh, well, thank you. But this is just awful. That, you could get the Prime Minister standing up making an announcement which is totally false, totally spurious, and nobody could detect it. And the capacity for something like this to happen at some point, whether it's North Korea and fake news, I'm going to bomb you, or that kind of thing, the capacity for that to happen exists. And yes, we should be aware of it, if not running around being fearful of it. And therefore worked out what can we do to prevent this. I think what Claire's doing is a big step down on the right path to identify it. But then you've got to get to a point where you can stamp it out or at least try to stop it. And I think that can only happen at the Facebook, Twitter, Google level. And those companies, you're quite right, they've got a lot of questions to ask on just how they do it. But I think that's where the buck stops. They've got to act, otherwise we're all going to be living in a very uncertain and increasingly dangerous world because of this fake news, sorry Claire, phenomenon.
Terri, can I just go to you, reflect on the Cronulla riots? You can obviously see there that there's a fear that this sort of thing could happen again. It can be driven by fake news.
I guess the difference between 2017 and 2005 is that in 2005 you had a broadcaster reading things out. Now if things were tweeted, you would every other person on Twitter would be able to have the same level of capacity to broadcast or narrowcast messages. So the difference between having a radio broadcaster who could reach hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, and being on Twitter where you have a less, I guess, maybe a lesser reach, but everyone else has the same reach as you. They get on the hashtag. If you tweet on the Quanda hashtag now, you're just as likely for your tweet to be seen as pretty much anyone else's. There's some who will be up in the algorithm. So although it is definitely a tool for spreading misinformation and disinformation, it's also a tool for spreading crowdsourced correction of misinformation and disinformation. And I think that's probably, while there's greater risk, I think there's also possibly greater opportunities to counteract the fake news.
Claire, are you optimistic in that regard that there could be some sort of balance if these media were used to try and raise again the sort of anger that led to the riots in Cronulla?
I really, really worry about hate speech, and I see it as distinctive and different than fake news. And in the US, we're involved in a project called Documenting Hate, where we're actually mining social media, looking for examples of that, and people talking about, seeing swastikas daubed on a bus stop. And when you go into those cesspools, it's horrific. And I think, we have to recognise that, and the social networks have to be held to account. And in Germany this week, they've just put a new bill. It might, pass in September, but saying that they'll fine the social networks up to 50 million, specifically around hate speech if it's not taken down.
Absolutely.
And something like YouTube takes down 90% of things that are flagged. Facebook is something like 36%. Twitter is even lower. So we have to start saying to these social networks, you have a responsibility. And this isn't about free speech. When there's specific hate speech, which is different to fake news, I do think as society we have to think about how we do that, and we have to work with the platforms to say, you have a responsibility to take this down.
Wadah, we are running out of time. So
yeah, Tony, when you think about the biggest scandals happened in the last few decades, I mean, the massacre in Rwanda, the massacre between the Serbs and the Bosnians, even the war that's taking place right now in Syria and the sectarian problems in Iraq, there was a lot of hate speech. That's true. A lot of people might be angry against each other. But when politicians join this kind of hate to a race or a group or religious group, then things become actually very dangerous. I noticed in all of the above mentioned, always there is tension between minorities, between majorities, whatever. Governments, the legislations, the politicians should ensure that this, level of racism doesn't become acknowledged and recognized as a legitimate tool of attacking or marginalising a group in particular.
Zed, I'll have to hear from you because you're the Minister of Multicultural.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, just briefly to answer your question, I mean, I think Terry's point in relation to the countering, and that is part of the democratic nature of social media and other things. There are all sorts of downsides. I don't see, notwithstanding the terrible situation that you refer to in terms of the Cronulla riot, I don't see that most Australians are somehow likely to go and become a raging mob, even if they are incited on Facebook. Now, incited to violence should be condemned and should be against the law. Absolutely.
Is that what happened in Cronulla, though? Was there an incitement?
Well, look,
coming from the broadcast, not a politician.
I wouldn't claim to be an expert on all of the detail in terms of Cronulla. I would say it was a shameful moment in our history, but I don't see that as somehow reflective of the broader Australian character. I don't see that there is a baying mob waiting to riot in Australia. I just don't accept that.
Well, there was a baying mob in that case. Are you saying that we learned from that experience and wouldn't do it again?
I think, of course, we've learned from it, and I think you would hardly say that that's a normal experience in Australia. It is thankfully exceedingly rare, and we do all we can as a society to make sure that we never see things like that happen again.
Okay. All right, we've got a sorry, I'm just told we're going to a different question. It's this one's from Annalise Graham.
Hi. Many young people are avid users and consumers on our social media channels, and we have an appetite for fast and exciting news. When we see publications post what turn out to be bogus stories, should we be giving them the benefit of the doubt, putting it down to an extremely fast-paced news cycle? Or should we stop sharing, unfollow, or call out their false nature? Where can we draw the line?
Claire Wardle, I suppose this is what you do really, is to run around the world now try to explain to journalists how to actually deal with this phenomenon. What's your, you have to boil it down to a few key points, but what is the main thing one would need to do to combat what you don't like to call fake news?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about journalists. So we're having these discussions about fake news and other people. Every day, news organisations around the world make mistakes. They retweet false photos. They share incorrect information. So anybody who sees that should be calling out journalists. And the problem is now, because resources are being squashed in newsrooms, because of the timing on social media, everybody thinks that they have to be the first. Actually, we should be putting pressure on newsrooms to say, I don't necessarily need you to be first, I just need you to be right.
Absolutely.
And I think once we start saying we're going to go elsewhere, and I think you're right about young people, newsrooms are terrified that they will never be able to get you. They're absolutely terrified about Snapchat. So actually, you have a lot of power. So I think it's up to your generation.
Well, it sounds like they already don't have her, because she's getting, by the sound of it, her information from social media. So the question is, what do you do about that? I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, who's the boss of Facebook, openly admits that there's misinformation and hoaxes, but he said you can't really easily separate that out from satire and comment. So, I mean, how do you, what role do the consumers of this have?
Well, two things. Firstly, Facebook should think about design, and that actually within the Facebook feed, they should have much clearer flags about the types of information. Is this opinion? Is it satire? Is it et cetera, et cetera? But in terms of, what a consumer can do, actually doing a reverse image search, or doing a whois lookup to say, where was this domain registered? Oh, in Macedonia 2 weeks ago. There are those kind of checks, but I don't like this idea that it's up to individual consumers to do all those checks. I want to see the social networks think more about design, giving context in posts, not necessarily, deprioritising things in the algorithm, but just giving users more information.
Mark Day?
Yes,
as a journalist, what's your advice to young consumers of this sort of information?
Get it first, get it right. But if you do make a mistake, correct it quickly. It's that old thing, if we're wrong, we're not wrong for long. By all means, correct it quickly. Yes, but I think we've just got to lay the blame where it lies and push for corrective measures where it can happen, and that's in the social media landscape rather than the mainstream. The mainstream can go hell for leather doing what it's been doing forever, digging up the facts and reporting them. But it's not where the vast audiences, particularly young people, reside anymore, I'm afraid. That's my great lament.
I'll just go to you, the other journalists on the panel, and you've only got about 30 seconds.
Actually, investigative journalism has been sacrificed by most of corporations, media groups, because it is expensive. They don't want to spend a lot of money. That's a very important issue, because where authentication and context come together. Field reporting has been sacrificed because it's expensive as well. So I think organizations, media organizations, should save some money from the huge administrative costs and this pyramid-like, kind of institutions, and spend more on content, proper content in the field and investigation.
We have to leave it there. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Wadah, Khanfar, Seselja, Claire Wardle, Mark Day and Terri Butler. Thank you very much. And remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra. Join Tracy Holmes and her guest, Sunny Cray, the commissioning editor at The Conversation on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live. They're taking talk back and they're discussing your social media comments and questions as soon as we finish. Now, next Monday on Q&A, former Hunters and Collectors frontman Mark Seymour will throw his arms around your questions with National Senator Bridget McKenzie, Labor frontbencher Amanda Rishworth and businessman Peter Holmes at court. Until next week, good night.